Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Political Debrief Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Oliverio. Last week, Alberta's United Conservative Party elected a new leader and premier. Danielle Smith announced a very controversial piece of legislation while campaigning for leader, with her introduction of the Alberta Sovereignty Act, an act which she says would allow Alberta to reclaim its sovereignty from the federal government. To talk about what the heck that all means, I'm joined now by Associate Professor of Political Science at Mount Royal University, Professor Lori Williams. Lori Williams, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you.
So let's just start from the beginning of the whole process to have a new premier in Alberta, for those of us who might not be familiar. When did this start, and kind of what's the campaign been like to elect the new leader of the United Conservative Party?
The impetus for the leadership race that culminated on last Thursday evening was the announcement that Jason Kenney would resign. And the reason he said he would resign is because he got only 51.4% in a leadership review. And even though technically that is a majority, and he had been saying that that was sufficient for him to continue, the reality is when you have the support of barely half of your party, that's just not a tenable position to continue in. So then we saw Danielle Smith announce her candidacy for that position. She'd been criticizing Jason Kenney and calling for him to make some changes in a number of different policy areas, notably around COVID policy, but also grassroots democracy. And she sort of threw her hat into the ring, the first of anyone, followed closely by Brian Jean, who had also been criticizing Jason Kenney and pushing for his resignation or major shifts in policies. And so with those two sort of frontrunners, both of them former Wild Rose Party leaders, and remember the United Conservative Party is a combination of the Wild Rose Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. Those folks threw their hats in the ring very early in the process, followed a little bit later by Travis Taves, who was the second runner-up in the leadership race last Thursday. The other candidates running for the leadership were additional former cabinet members who had served with Jason Kenney, and Todd Loewen, who'd been ejected from the party. So the campaign was pretty much driven by Danielle Smith's controversial announcements and statements, most notably around the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And we just saw the rest of the leadership candidates reacting to Danielle Smith and her proposal. And what the Sovereignty Act stands for is anybody's guess, because Danielle Smith has said that it means that we won't enforce federal laws, and she said that it will mean something much more watered down than that. So it's just not clear what exactly she means by it. Certainly those who wrote the idea in this Alberta First strategy were talking about actually provoking a constitutional crisis. And Danielle Smith sometimes spoke as though she was trying to put pressure on the federal government along those lines. At other times said it was just a matter of keeping control over what is within Alberta's sovereignty. And because that was such a controversy, that and some of the things she said about healthcare were such a focus of controversy, that's what got most of the media attention, both regular media and social media. It seemed like everybody was reacting to Danielle Smith, and the campaign wound up being about something that very few Albertans support or are even primarily concerned about. Most Albertans, as most Canadians, are concerned about healthcare. They're concerned about affordability, economic diversification, and things of that nature. They're concerned about education, and those things, although spoken about here and there by all of the candidates, just didn't dominate the focus of the campaign. So now we've got this big gap between a campaign that focused on issues that aren't front and center, or certainly not supported by the majority of Albertans, and a new premier who wants to govern that doesn't really have clear a clear vision or plans around some of the issues that are primary concern to Albertans.
So yeah, let's jump into that Alberta Sovereignty Act that's being proposed. Now, Premier Danielle Smith said today at her swearing in that it's one of her top priorities. It's the first piece of legislation that she wants to get passed. But even over the last 24 hours, there have been some contradicting stories about the Sovereignty Act. Some reports saying it's going to be a very watered down version of what Premier Smith said it would be during the campaign, and others saying that it's going to be as strong as possible and that they're going to, override federal government law and potentially court rulings. In terms of the general population of Alberta, you mentioned that it's not very popular or it's not talked about a whole lot among the general population. Do you think that there is a certain demographic or a certain type of voter that Premier Smith is trying to reach out to with this legislation?
Well, there's no question that her strategy during the leadership campaign was to try to sell memberships to Albertans who were very angry about COVID policy, who want a tougher stance with respect to Ottawa. And I will say that advocating for Alberta's interest within Canada is something that is quite popular in Alberta. But this particular version of it, looking as though you're refusing to enforce federal laws or follow court decisions, essentially undermining the rule of law and threatening investment in Alberta. That particular version was one that a lot of Albertans very clearly, in a number of polls, indicated that they did not support. Nevertheless, Danielle Smith's primary goal in winning the leadership was to appeal to that sort of angry base, those folks that she could rely on to sell memberships to, the folks that she could rely on voting for her because she was touting such a strong stance with respect to these ideas. That was her strategy in the election campaign. Now, if she shifts significantly from some of the things she said, as I said, there were very different things she said about what the Sovereignty Act could do during the election campaign. Those of us who were watching were quite confused about what she actually thought that it stood for, because there wasn't a consistent message about what it would contain. So it's either going to be something that involves defying court decisions, defying federal laws within Alberta, or it's going to be just being vigilant about what is within Alberta's sovereign control and perhaps trying to fight harder to get concessions from Ottawa. So now that she's won the leadership, she has a significant number of people in Alberta who don't support the stronger version of that, and a bunch of people who voted her into office who do want the stronger version of it. And she's somehow got to keep the voters that got her into the premiership and win voters that have deep questions about what the Sovereignty Act stands for or promises. And ultimately, she's got to get support from her own caucus to get it through the legislature. And that's probably going to mean watering it down from at least some of the things she said during the leadership campaign.
Right, and you mentioned about people, voting her in to implement that, but the general population, the general voters in Alberta didn't elect Danielle Smith to be the premier. It was voted on by about 100,000 UCP party members. So there is an election coming up early next year in Alberta. The NDP is already starting to kind of start their campaign and that kind of thing. Do you think that at this point it's off the table to say that the NDP would come in and absolutely destroy a Danielle Smith government, or do you think it's too early to make those kind of predictions?
There's no question, according to polling that's currently been done by two very reputable and reliable pollsters, people who are pretty good at figuring out how the vote's going to break out in Alberta, that if an election were held today, Danielle Smith would not win a majority. The NDP would. We do have the situation where Danielle Smith came to power. Now, remember, about 85,000 people voted in this election, and she got just over 50% of those voters. So somewhere in the 40 plus thousand range. is where Danielle Smith sits. So with 40,000 and change voters, she's now the premier of Alberta, and this is the way things go in leadership campaigns. It's not the first time where a tiny minority of voters selected a new premier. The problem is that the message that she used to sort of gin up that anger and ride that anger to the premier's office is not representative of the vast majority of Albertans, and it could put her in a position where she's made promises and statements that could come back and haunt her later. And of course, she's in the position now where she has to appeal to the broader range of Albertans without alienating the folks that voted for her and brought her to office. I mean, what's to prevent those folks who wanted her to take a very strong stance against Ottawa? What's to prevent them from turning on her like they did on Jason Kenney when he failed to deliver on some of his promises? So she's got a lot of challenges before her. In this leadership race, she won about 2% more of the party vote than Jason Kenney did in that leadership review. So again, she definitely has to expand the support, not only within the party, but amongst Albertans generally. And so it's going to be a very interesting campaign. Now, the advantages Danielle Smith has going for her are the fact that there's a very large surplus. She's got a lot of money to work with, a lot of people who are looking for solutions to problems like affordability, healthcare system, education, and so forth. She can address some of those with wise investments. The question will be whether she can overcome some of the legacy that she's left, some of the things she said in the past, some of the policy positions she's taken, some of the things that have deeply offended Albertans. I mean, she made a statement about essentially suggesting that alternative medicine and lifestyle choices can prevent people from getting cancer, which it just exploded into anger amongst people who have had cancer or have loved ones who've had cancer and perhaps died of that disease. And so there's anger against Danielle Smith as well as anger for Danielle Smith that brought her to the leadership. So her challenge will be to try to appeal to that broad range of Albertans, and particularly within the party, try to appeal to the folks within the party that disagree. I mean, Jason Kenney was constantly trying to please sort of both sides, as if there are just two sides of the party. It's multifaceted. But he tried to appeal to the various factions within the party and always left somebody dissatisfied. And that's going to be very difficult for Danielle Smith to avoid. Now, we know that Rachel Notley is offering sort of a more stable alternative than the United Conservative Party has been able to provide in recent months and years. And so Rachel Notley has that to her credit, and advantages she can work with, and of course Danielle Smith's record. But we're a little more than 7 months away from our next election, and a lot can happen in that time, as we know.
And in terms of the Sovereignty Act, it will be obviously for a lot of these questions that many people have. It's just honestly going to have to be a wait and see once that legislation gets tabled. Um, could you see this type of legislation spreading to other provinces? And I'm thinking of Quebec would be an interesting example of that.
Well, Danielle Smith frequently says that she wants Alberta to do what Quebec has done. In other words, use sort of the threat of greater autonomy or constitutional challenges and so forth. Use that same sort of strategy to get more autonomy or authority over what happens within Alberta's border than previously has been the case. So I think there are a lot of questions about what that would look like. Quebec already, of course, is challenging central constitutional principles with two bills, Bill 21 on religious symbols and 96, I think it is, in Quebec, talking about language rights. So clearly we're getting challenges being brought by provinces against essentially the entire sort of framework of Canada and what the rights and freedoms and constitutional jurisdiction of various parts of the Federation are. So obviously already we've seen musings by Quebec's premier that he thinks this sort of strategy is a good idea. But I think what a lot of people are forgetting is that we as a federation rely on other provinces and on the federal government for a lot of things that make it possible for us to do the things that we want to do. So let's just take the example of pipelines. So Alberta wants this autonomy, wants control over what happens within its borders. If that were to be a successful strategy, what's to prevent British Columbia from saying, well, we're going to be stronger within our borders and we're not going to allow pipelines coming from Alberta through our borders? Or provinces to the east of us saying that they don't want pipelines, or territories to the north of us to say that they don't want pipelines. So the reality that our federation requires this sort of give and take, the cooperation and collaboration between and amongst the provinces and the federal government doesn't mean you can't advocate for what you think is more respect or fairness within that system. But I think there are real dangers with challenging the existing framework, insisting on more autonomy from the federal government, and then that could make it difficult or impossible for provinces to cooperate on things like pipelines, and it could mean that Alberta is in a worse position as a result of these kinds of pressures than it would have been had these not been begun.
The federal government's response to the Sovereignty Act specifically has been a little bit broad, and they've been kind of quiet about it, probably waiting to get the actual text of the legislation before they respond. How will the federal government's response to whatever Premier Smith ends up tabling in December, how will that response be measured or felt by Albertans, and how could that influence their voting choice in May of 2023?
So we have seen Jason Kenney trying to do similar things. He had that equalization referendum that didn't seem to have any impact at all on federal-provincial relations or Alberta's position in the federation. But we now are seeing that Danielle Smith wants to try to do something that's a little bit different than that. And the question will be, will it make any difference? Can it make any difference? Will there be enough buy-in from other provinces and the federal government to move things in a different direction? Up until this point, the federal government has essentially said, look, we're willing to work with provinces or with leaders within provinces, whether those leaders are the provincial premier or mayors of cities or even community leaders, work with people to try to serve the people that have voted for all levels of government. So we've seen in the past, for example, the federal government offering a child care plan, or during COVID, providing funding to businesses and individuals within provinces. Or we've seen the fiscal stabilization payments and so forth, to the point where Alberta was actually a net recipient of federal funds during the pandemic for the first time in a very long time. And I think that's worth noting, that at least some Albertans recognize that some kind of give and take between Alberta and the federal government could be mutually beneficial. And I think there are a lot of questions about how Albertans as a whole really want to see that relationship go, or what they think will be most successful. Rachel Notley, when she was premier, turned public opinion around regarding pipelines from about 38% support for pipelines in January, I think, of 2018 it was, and by the spring of that year, support had actually gone up to the high 60s. So again, is this sort of confrontational style going to be most effective? Is some combination of confrontation and collaboration likely to work? What exactly is it that Albertans are looking for, and what is actually going to work? I think some people are thinking that because the equalization referendum didn't have the desired effect, that maybe ramping it up a little bit will make a difference. But again, the Sovereignty Act, at least some versions of it, as touted by Danielle Smith and some of her supporters, isn't something that the majority of Albertans are on side with. So there's going to have to be a bit of softening on that. And then it'll be a question of, well, which vision for the future do Albertans buy into? Who do they think is going to have the best chance of getting things that Alberta wants going forward? Is that likely to be Danielle Smith, or is that likely to be Rachel Notley?
And, issues that involve young people are very involved and very mentioned and talked about in the media. Even though it might not be directly, the media across all levels of government and national, provincial, we're always talking about, education, healthcare, affordability, housing affordability more specifically. Do you think that Premier Smith will address any of these issues in her 6 or 7 months before she has to go to the voters?
Sure, I have no doubt that she's going to try to address some of these. That we just don't have any sense at all at this stage what that will be. I mean, so far on healthcare, she's talked about a $300 spending account that Albertans can use however they want. But that's not going to help the Albertans who don't have a doctor or who can't get diagnostic testing done or can't get in for surgery or treatment or so forth. She's also talked about firing the board of the Alberta Health Services, the administrative agency that oversees the healthcare system. And she's talked about firing the board of the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is a power that the Premier doesn't have as things stand right now, and could raise significant issues, legal issues, if it were attempted. But getting rid of the leadership is not a plan for how to fix the system. The entire country, in fact, beyond Canada's borders, there's a shortage of health care resources, doctors, nurses, frontline workers, and so forth. And so the question becomes, even though she's got a lot of money to work with, will that be enough to actually address the problems of access to healthcare that many people are experiencing, in part as a result of the strains put on the healthcare system by the pandemic, but also because of underinvestment in the healthcare system in the past. So that's the healthcare question. Education, I think, might be a little bit easier to address. I think it's possible to invest in resources for schools K to 12, also post-secondary, provide access both to the classrooms, to affordable tuition, student loans with a favorable repayment system, but also things like housing that are extremely important for students. I mean, we're seeing in Alberta, just like in the rest of the country, university students that are having a hard time finding a place to stay while they attend university. So those are things that, again, some of them will take longer term solutions. Some investments in the short term can make a difference in the next 7 or 8 months. Others are going to take much longer. Housing is a problem that isn't going to be solved in the next 7 or 8 months. The issues with the healthcare system are not going to be resolved in the next 7 or 8 months. So the question becomes whether Danielle Smith is able to make enough of a difference, move things in a direction that's seen as meaningful, sufficient so that people are willing to entrust her with another 4 years.
And lastly, what is going to make Danielle Smith's government a two-term or a three-term government that gets, kind of her name out, or what's going to make Danielle Smith's government a success and reelected a couple of times?
That looks to be a pretty difficult challenge for any leader, frankly, in Alberta. We've only had one premier complete their entire term in office since 2008, I believe it was, and that premier was Rachel Notley. But of course, she was a one-term premier. The problems that Alberta is facing are significant. The divisions within the United Conservative Party are persistent and continuing. And so I think managing a single term is quite an accomplishment in this particular political climate. Winning re-election in the spring is going to be a great challenge for Danielle Smith, partly because the problems that most Albertans are concerned with are not something that any government can simply resolve. I mean, there are world leaders that are struggling with inflation, with high gas prices. I mean, all kinds of international factors are contributing to that. Things like the war in Ukraine, the decision recently by OPEC countries to reduce production. Healthcare challenges again exceed the capacity of a single province or even country to address, in the short term. So I think the short-term challenge for Danielle Smith and the race to the spring of 2023 for both Danielle Smith and for Rachel Notley is to try to present visions for the future, and for Danielle Smith to actually make meaningful steps toward achieving the vision that she's talking about. And she doesn't have a cabinet even yet. It's not clear who the experts she's going to draw on to try to address some of these problems will be. It's not clear what her policies are going to be along these lines. So she certainly has an opportunity to try to convince a lot of Albertans, but she also has some liabilities in that she has said and done things in the past that are leading to some skepticism and reticence on the part of voters.
Awesome. Professor Williams, thank you so much for joining me today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for the YouTube edition of the Political Debrief podcast. Thank you so much for watching. As always, you can take a look down below to see notes about the episode, such as our website, which has a blog post just dedicated to this episode with some additional information about the topic and about my guest. Down below, there's also that link to that email sign-up form, so you can get email alerts whenever we publish a new episode. I encourage you to do that. You can subscribe on YouTube to find an alert whenever we publish a new video. And follow me on Twitter at Josh Oliverio to stay updated about general political news, but also about some news about the show. And lastly, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever, to get alerts on your phone and download them and listen to them on the go, in the car, or on the airplane, wherever you choose. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode. Thank you.